think my experience was a little bit different, clearly, because I am the white guy, and with a Filipino woman. And I think, coming from her culture, you just don't talk about race. It's just something like she just didn't want to talk about it. And I think coming from the outside, coming from a very sheltered, non-diverse background, I became very hypersensitive to every little thing that I thought was some sort of racial slight, whether it was in a restaurant not getting served or seated properly, or it was, in a store not being helped, or having my wife being watched because she came in and speaking a different language on the phone to her sister or something.
We'll discuss race and how it plays a factor, and how we didn't even talk about this topic because we were afraid.
A Black Executive Perspective.
Welcome to a Black Executive Perspective podcast, a safe space where we discuss all matters related to race, especially race in corporate America. I'm your host, Tony Tidbit. And again, today we're at the University of New Haven in sunny New Haven, Connecticut. We want to thank the University of New Haven for partnering with the Black Executive Perspective podcast, allowing us to use their fabulous podcast studio. Go Chargers. Also, please check out our partners, Code M Magazine, whose mission is to save the Black family by first saving the Black man. Check them out at codemmagazine.com.
On July 11, 1958, at 2 a.m., a county sheriff entered the home of Virginia couple Richard and Mildred Loving, forced them out of their bed, and placed them under arrest. Their crime? Interracial marriage. They were tried and found guilty of violating Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, a series of laws that made race mixing illegal. On June 12, 1967, the court unanimously struck down the Virginia marriage ban and overturned the Lovings' conviction. The court ruling reverberated across America, invalidating anti-miscegenation laws not only in Virginia, but in 16 other states that held them as well. After winning their case, the Lovings were finally free to do what they wanted to do all along. They lived quietly in Virginia as husband and wife until Richard's death in 1975.
So today, we commemorate the anniversary of the Supreme Court case Loving versus Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage here in the United States. We'll dive deeper into complexities 57 years later of interracial relationships. Following our previous discussion of challenges faced by biracial teenagers in our episode Too Black to Be White and Too White to Be Black, today we shift our focus to their fathers, who will share their personal experiences regarding their interracial marriages, as well as tackling this public discrimination, navigating their children's identity issues, and confronting racial microaggressions. Robert Townsend, Brian Stern, and Shawn Norville, welcome to a Black Executive Perspective podcast, my brothers.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Well, number one, we want to thank you for investing the time to come on to talk about a very important topic. And as you saw the clip, 57 years later, interracial marriage was struck down. The ban against interracial marriage was struck down in 1967. Now we're 57 years later. So it would be great to hear you guys' perspective on your relationships, your family, your children, and all the things that you deal with. So everybody's definitely interested to learn more about your experiences. So to kick this off, it'll be great if we can get a little bit background from everyone. So starting with Brian, you go first. Please introduce yourself. Tell us about your current occupation, where you're living, and the racial makeup of your spouse.
Sure. Thank you for having me back, Tony. It's great to be with you again on the podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. So giving just a little bit background on me, currently I help people become entrepreneurs. That's my job. I coach people in the world of entrepreneurship. As far as my marriage, I am coming up on my 16th anniversary, being married to a very beautiful Filipino woman who was born and raised in a very rural part of the Philippines. She came over here as an adult when we met. And we have a beautiful daughter at the age of 13. So a brand new teenager in the household, which is a whole other thing to have fun to talk about as well.
I can imagine, my friend. And where are you residing at, Brian?
I am on the Jersey Shore.
Okay, great. So he's in New Jersey. So welcome, my brother. And again, for those who probably not aware, Brian Stern came on and talked about his interracial marriage back in one of our earlier episodes. So I'm so glad you came back, my friend. Shawn.
My brother, Shawn Norville. My wife and I have been married for 18 years, but we've known each other since college, so we're coming up on a quarter century at this point. I am from the island of Barbados. My wife is from Southeast Asia, from India, and that's where her family's from. And, we reside currently right now in Los Angeles, but we're formerly New York residents, New York proud. Our kids now are 8, 6, 4, and 2, 3 boys and 1 girl. And they're quite the project management nightmare.
Seems like you got your hands full, my brother. So it's all good, though. It's all good. So again, thanks, Shawn. Really appreciate you joining a Black Executive Perspective to talk about this topic. Robert Towns.
How you doing? Thank you for having me, and thank you for opening up this dialogue, because I think this is very important to have, our perspective on this topic, and I look forward to diving into this conversation more. So, Robert Towns, I am a director of external affairs at a local children's museum in Norwalk, Connecticut. I live in Connecticut. Been married to my wife for 19 years. We're coming up on 20 this October. We're looking forward to celebrating that. I have a 16-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl. Very excited to talk about this for a lot of reasons, including the fact that we mentioned Loving versus Virginia. My family is from Virginia originally. I grew up in Connecticut, but my family's from Virginia. So I drive past that historical marker on Route 301 in Virginia all the time that marks where they were arrested. And so this is something that I've thought about, Supreme Court decisions and the current climate. And it's like, this is time to talk about this again. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, my brother. I really appreciate that. And the racial makeup of your wife, your lovely wife?
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries.
Sorry. Yes, racial makeup of my family. My wife is Italian-Irish, from, like I said, here in Connecticut. And I'm a Black American, family from Virginia. And, one of the things about our family as well is that whole Virginia thing. We go into the Deep South sometimes, and it is a different place. And 1967 still exists in certain pockets of Virginia. So, again, like I said, the fact that my white wife can go down there, I'm really looking forward to being able to dive deeper into this.
Okay, bro. Well, let's start with you on this then, right?
Yeah.
Tell us, why did you want to come on a Black Executive Perspective podcast to talk about this topic?
The biggest reason is because I'm concerned about the present. I know we talk about 1967 as if that's a long time ago, but so much of what's happening today may counteract a lot of the progress that's been made over the last few years and last, 50 something years. I'm talking about my mom really quickly. The movie Remember the Titans, that's 1970 in Virginia. Mm-hmm. It's about the desegregation of a high school in Northern Virginia. Well, that was also my mom's senior year. I was born in 1975. So I don't have to go back into the history books to talk about what the time was like before all of this happened. I can just talk to my mom about it. I'm blessed that she's still with us to be able to do that. And that's part of the conversation right now is we tend to think that so much of this stuff happened so long ago, and it really didn't. And, we still have to be vocal about it right now so we can ensure that these rights sustain. We don't want to go backwards.
Exactly, my brother. Thank you for that. Brian, why did you want to come on BEP to talk about this?
Well, the same reasons that Robert mentioned. Number one, the history repeats itself if you don't learn from it. And I think we can be part of helping to educate people a little bit through our experiences. And I think the second reason is, and we talked about this a little bit last time, is that this is not a topic that I have spent a lot of time talking about, even with my own wife. And I actually appreciate having a safe space to come and talk about these issues and learn from others that are experiencing a lot of the same things that I might be experiencing.
Thanks, man. Shawn?
For me, it's about when we talk about today's world and the youth, Robert hit it on it. I always talk to all the young kids that I mentor and tell them how much progress we've made in the world. I start with the positive and said, it's been, if you really think about in the grand scheme of world things, we've made great strides as Black people in a short period of time, but we cannot forget how much more we have to go. And for some reason, this country, ever since we've had a Black president, has forgotten that there's racism that exists in this world, in this country. And for us, it's rapidly deteriorating the strides that we've made. And for some of us who, grew up a little bit younger, maybe in the 90s, it feels like we fell asleep at the wheel a little bit. And there's a movement that's sort of shifting the fabric, the laws in our country. And if we're not steadfast in terms of how we respond to it, we could lose a lot of different things. And as a person who has biracial kids, there's always a talk about them being Black or the one drop rule, or, being of a different ethnicity, and just sort of not being either or. But for them, I want them to understand their ethnicity on both sides, not just, one or the other. But it's important for me to have this dialogue, give my experience, so that other people out there in the community can understand and learn from that. And also just reach out and just say, hey, look, there's somebody else having these same issues. My kids are relatively young, but they face racism at quite a young age, from kindergarten down to, second grade. And that's why I wanted to be on here, to just talk about those things so people can be cognizant and aware.
Well, thank all three of you. I really appreciate that. And you guys totally make sense. And I cannot disagree with anything you all said. So let me ask you this question. Are you guys ready to talk about it?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, my brothers, let's talk about it. So, Shawn, I'm going to back up to you, my friend. So, you guys been married 19 years. You're originally from the East Coast, New York, correct? So
Correct.
Just briefly talk a little bit about where you grow up. And then the follow-up question I have, did you ever see yourself when you were young being in an interracial relationship? And not that you're old today, my brother. All right,
I'm a little long in the tooth.
I'm talking tadpole time, okay? So when you were tadpole, did you see yourself being in an interracial relationship?
Honestly, no. From what I know, and again, I speak to my experience, and my family's from Barbados, and if you understand how the slave trade worked, you understand there's a lot of people from Southeast Asia and from India who have been, part of that process, made it to Africa and some parts of South America and some parts of the Caribbean islands. So when I talk about being an interracial marriage, the woman that I've married historically, and from where I'm from, where she visually looks like people where I'm from, right? And from the islands that I had, that we sort of converse with. So for me, it wasn't like I was being an interracial marriage or I was marrying somebody outside of my culture.
Got it.
Because I really married someone that I thought was similar to my culture. But it was everyone else's viewpoint of who I was marrying, and also her family as well. So it was interesting dynamic in growing up in New York, Brooklyn specifically, where you're spoiled with the melting pot that you are in. But once you leave those areas of comfort and safety, everyone looks at you differently. Everyone has different questions, and then everyone treats you a little sort of way. So, that's a little bit about us.
Oh, thanks, buddy. Brian, let me pose the same question to you, my brother.
So I grew up in rural New Jersey, out in horse country, and it was incredibly, for lack of a better term, white, right? Very little diversity. So no, I really did not conceive of being in an interracial relationship when I grew older. So the big difference for me was when I moved to New York and getting exposure to just an incredible array of different cultures and experiences that really opened my eyes. But from a family standpoint, I think my family was always open to the idea. There wasn't any tension or any issue there. It was just never something that was part of our discussion.
Right. Robert, what about you, my man? I know you Virginia, and so speak.
So I grew up in Southern Connecticut. I grew up in Stamford,
Got it.
right here in the tri-state area. So a lot of diversity in my town. But I talk about those Virginia years because I used to spend my summers in Virginia. So a lot of formative time away from the diversity that I knew existed back at home. But then you'd go to Virginia and everything was black and white. So for me growing up, did I ever think that I would be in an interracial relationship? I grew up with a lot of people from a lot of diverse backgrounds, but never did. I never thought about it at all. And one of the things with my family is they've always been open to me being able to be with whoever I wanted to be and bring home who I brought home, but didn't have to walk far to hear other things as well. And, I know, for instance, within the Black community, some people would say, hey, if she can't use your comb, don't bring her home. So I would hear the stuff like that. But then also growing up in Stanford, I knew what those town lines meant. So crossing into certain communities, like a New Canaan or a Darien or a Greenwich, and knowing that I'm not welcome.
Right.
And so, like people, know that they don't want me to be brought home to daddy, so to speak.
Well, just hold on one second, Robert, just so everybody's on the same page, because not everybody's from Connecticut.
So
when you say Darien and
Greenwich, Stanford, Darien, they're the southernmost towns or cities in Connecticut, about 30 miles away from New York City. But they call a nickname for Fairfield County, Connecticut, is the Gold Coast. And those are three of the wealthiest towns in the United States as well. So Stanford is a very diverse, socioeconomic and racially diverse area, town of about 130, 140,000. But those other surrounding towns are very, very different, and very wealthy. And as a matter of course, a lot of times not as welcoming to that diversity, or at least they were back then.
Right. Not, and it wasn't it's not a very diverse area.
Not diverse at all. Socioeconomically, everybody's pretty wealthy.
Got it. So let me ask you this, and I'll start with Brian. So what attracted you? So your wife is Asian. What attracted you to your wife?
Wow, what a loaded question, huh?
Don't mess up.
Yeah, I know, right? She's standing right behind me. She was introduced to me through a friend. And I think, the friend thought we had a lot in common, and we did. So I think a lot of it wasn't the differences between us. It was just the commonalities, similar sense of humor, similar passions for, some of our hobbies like traveling and, different things culturally that we were both attracted to. I think it was a lot of those commonalities. I mean, it's the same as any relationship, I suppose, right? It's the things that draw you together are going to be the commonalities versus the differences. So I don't know. I don't think that race had any factor in what brought us together at all.
Right.
It certainly has played a factor since we've been together,
right,
but not part of the initiation of the relationship at all.
Right. Shawn.
Yeah. That feels like one of those Steve Harvey Family Feud questions. When if you answer it the wrong way, you might be on the couch for the next week.
You can either get no points, or you can get 100 points.
No, it's really and truly it was her values. They mimicked a lot of my values. The way she conducted herself with her parents, the way she viewed life, the way she viewed family, the way she operated. It was very similar and in line with how I and my family operate, and the way I treated my mother, the way I respected my father. And when we were really best friends in the beginning. And it was funny because we met in accounting, which was probably one of my best subjects. But I was just like, let me just really go all in this. And I got to the point where she was like looking at my notes. I'm like, wait a second. Stereotypically, I'm like, I'm supposed to be looking at your notes, right? And and we just formed a bond where we listened to the same music, ate similar foods. Like they have curry, we have different curries. They have roti, we have a little bit of variation of roti. Again, we talked about that slave trade similarity or that alignment. And funny enough, many people don't even understand or realize that connection, and we built that baseline connection, and that's what attracted me to her. The shared values, the shared cultural symbolicism of what her family life was like and what mine was like. It just made like a symbiotic relationship. You join that with living in similar settings and having similar familiarity, parental structures, and your mom being the matriarch, and just things of that nature, but still respecting the family dynamic of the husband and what he does in the relationship, and being the father and what that understands. And as you get older, you learn to appreciate that individual and that person more and more, to want to build a family with them. And that's what attracted me to my wife.
Got it. And Robert, I know your wife Shannon, so talk to me, my man. And she's going to listen to this. So.
Oh yes. So we met at work. We both worked at a local television station in New Haven, Connecticut. And the first thing that I would say about it is that we would have fun together at work. Lots of times laughing, joking, stuff like that. So sense of humor was pretty similar. despite the fact that she would never admit to that. But the other thing about it, though, is we had a lot of commonality with the things that we like to do. So she worked also at a hip hop station in New York. And so we had a lot of shared interest in the music and the artists that we were listening to. We had a good time when we would hang out together. And from there, it just blossomed. I mean, and then we realized that there were a lot of other commonalities as well. Both of us, the product of divorced households and other things like that, where there was shared experience.
Right.
And so despite the fact that we grew up in different places and we had different, racial backgrounds, we had a lot of similarities and we have a similar worldview. So things just clicked.
So what I'm hearing is that at the end of the day, and Brian, you said it point blank, that you guys met your spouses. It had anything to do with the color of their skin or anything like that. It's about commonality. It's about regular things that you would be attracted to with any human being. Is that correct? Exactly, right?
Nail on the head.
So at the end of the day, you're walking the earth, and at the end of the day, you run into your future wife, and you guys became friends, and a lot of things you guys like to do together. And the next thing you know, the relationship blossomed. And the last thing that came to your mind is like, oh, she's different than me and looks different than me, right? And you fell in love. So let's jettison a little ahead now. Now you're together. Now you love each other. However, tell us a little bit how the world saw you, or did you guys have certain conversations that you didn't have, that you didn't see internally because you just saw each other as the strengths and the love and this and that? But now you got to have conversations about how you look or how she looks. So who wants to kick that conversation off? When did that happen? Was that the first date, or was that 5 years into the marriage? Talk. Who want to kick that off? I'm gonna throw it out there. You guys.
I'll do it.
Okay,
I'll
Robert.
start,
Okay, go ahead, buddy. You biting. I see
so
you biting at the bit.
One of the things that from day one, and is unspoken with me, but I know that it was there for me, is wondering how people thought about it, what people thought. Because I've already had experienced it beforehand. Did not date interracially, but even just being around people at times, hearing comments. So I remember one time, for instance, New Year's Eve, out with friends, a diverse group, and I'm simply being a gentleman and walking someone to the bathroom, and this woman behind me says, "Leave her, leave the snowflake." I mean, you hear stuff like that. So I know and was ready for comments to come my way. One thing that didn't happen, though, is those comments didn't really happen. But I was prepared to think about that and how it would impact the way that we were. I also know another situation where going to meet family, and just wondering how the family is going to receive, et cetera. And so just trying to make sure, being ready for whatever happened, but being very blessed and very fortunate that nothing really did happen. No comments were really said that ever shook our foundation.
Did you guys, and just to be back up a second, you said ditch the snowflake. So just so everybody's clear, like, what does that mean?
So I was out like with a diverse group of people, and so one of the women in the party that we were out with was a white woman,
Mm-hmm.
and so at one point in the evening, she wanted to go to the restroom or something like that, and nobody was going to go with her, so I was just going to go stand by the door, just be a gentleman, right? And there was a group of black women there, and they thought I was with her. And so one of them said to me, it's New Year's Eve, so people had been drinking. And one of those women said to me, "Ditch the snowflake," like talking about the white woman.
Got it.
I'm like, that's my coworker. Like, we're not like that. But just knowing that kind of mentality exists.
Right.
Wanted to, like I said, when I was with, Shannon in the beginning, ready to deal with any kinds of slings and arrows that might come our way. And very blessed that nothing really happened like that. But we did end up having to have certain conversations just so we were prepared, knew how we would try to react if something were to happen, but we were blessed that nothing did happen.
Got it. Who wants to go next?
I'll go next. For me, we knew from day one it would be problematic from both cultures. Historically, like she knew where her family, they had just certain just things that traditions, cultural norms that they did, even down to just where the person is from and what language they spoke or what dialect, right? So it's very, it's very specific within her culture. For me, it was around, and I'll speak more to my side of it because as a Black man living in New York City, you are ultimately, if you start dating outside of your race, you are afraid of the Black woman, and the effect that that's going to have on her, but also the response you're going to get, right? And there's the, or the look or the nod while you're on the train with your significant other or girlfriend or whatever, and it sort of eats away at your soul because you almost sometimes feel like you're betraying your mother or your sister because there's this connotation that if you date outside of your race, you don't love Black women the same as you do other women because you've been brainwashed to like certain types of hair or certain types of complexions. And that complexity definitely added to, I want to say, hesitation, doubt, commitment, to the whole situation. And we live in a world where our bravado and being over sexualized women is sort of glorified. And I wasn't that really kind of guy where I knew when I met my wife, I told her when we were dating that I was going to marry her, and that she thought I was joking. But what she did not know that a year before I proposed to her, I was actually engaging into a relationship with building with her mom and speaking to her mother every other day because I understood culturally where she was at, right, and where she was and what she had to do. Meaning, she had to possibly be with me, and if being with me, that meant she had to walk away from her whole family, is what she thought at the time.
Right.
So it's on both sides. We were well aware of those factors. So I want to cut it short there, but I'll give Brian a chance as well to speak.
Thanks, Shawn. Brian?
Sure. Thank you. I think my experience was a little bit different, clearly, because I am the white guy and with a Filipino woman. I think, coming from her culture, you just don't talk about race. It's just something like she just didn't want to talk about it. And I think coming from the outside, coming from a very sheltered, non-diverse background, I became very hypersensitive to every little thing that I thought was some sort of racial slight, whether it was in a restaurant not getting served or seated properly, or it was, in a store not being helped, or having my wife being watched because she came in and speaking a different language on the phone to her sister or something. And I assumed everything was racial, and I wanted to be the guy who stood up for her, the hero would come in and, defend her honor. And so I became like, I know this is cliche, but like the angry white guy, right? Like I became the guy who was like, everything was racial and I wanted to talk about it and I wanted to fight everybody. I wanted to fight the world and get angry about it. But my wife just didn't want to talk about it. It just wasn't a big deal to her. So it actually festered with me because I didn't have an outlet to talk about it because, it's not something that she was ready to talk about. But it's something that I've had to develop a callus, over time. When you see these little things, it actually takes more energy to deal with this nonsense than it does to resolve the issue. And a lot of times I've learned that sometimes you just have to let things go, which still kind of eats at me a little bit, particularly when it comes to my child. Because what kind of example am I setting? Right? That's where it becomes a real issue. When we see these little things happen and my wife doesn't want to talk about it, she doesn't want me to address it, but my daughter is right there. How could I let it go?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Let me ask you this, though, Brian, because you said something. And well, let me say this first. What I'm hearing is, and I'm going to play back everything that you guys said, right? Hey, I got in this relationship, excluding Brian. He said something a little bit different, but let me just do Shawn and Robert. I got in this relationship. I fell in love with this person, but immediately I had a monkey on my back because I had to start thinking about all these other things. How the black woman is gonna deal, how they gonna look at me and treat me, how my family or her family may deal with certain things. So that's an extra weight immediately that you automatically start carrying just to have a relationship. Okay, so I want to get back to that, but I want to go to where Brian said, because Brian, you said, listen, I didn't, as soon as we came together, I started seeing. I became the angry white dude where everything became racial and every little slight, was it because of this? Was it because of that? Blah, blah, blah. Let me ask you this. Before you started dating your wife, did you see those slights before?
I think I did, but I just wasn't as sensitive to it. And I think that's a gift actually that I've been given, is that actually now I am sensitive to it. So on one hand, I'm very grateful that I have a much greater appreciation for how the world is.
Right.
Um, but it's also one of those things where it's, it's upsetting to know how the world is on that level too. And then the worst part about it is not knowing what to do and how to behave in those situations.
So let's go. So number one, thanks for sharing that. So Shawn, Robert, did you? So let's just go back to what you guys were saying. Hey, look, all of a sudden I had to worry about, what black people or black women specifically would say or look at me because I'm with my spouse. Okay, and then you had specifically, Robert, where ditch the snowflake. All right. So how did you get? Did you get over that? Okay, what did it take for you to overcome that in terms of you feeling confident that you're with who God put in your life to be with? Talk to us a little bit about that.
So I say number one, part of the way that I dealt with it before and still deal with it today is that we navigate that kind of space in the world all the time, including now. So the fact that I've been with my wife for about 25 years, we've been married for almost 20 now, it's still a daily occurrence. I'd never know when I walk into a space how things are going to be accepted. And I say that not just dealing with going into a black community and how black women or black people will treat us, but in certain, especially in areas where I'm not as familiar, don't know how white people or others will treat as well. So it's still a top of mind thing for me all along. The one thing I would say about it, though, is as far as the confidence is concerned, et cetera, is that I've just become more comfortable in my own skin
Right.
and don't care about what other people think as much anymore. When I was in my 20s, you still are trying to show out and show up and be around other people. But now I'm just living my life. And the reality is what would get my back up a little bit more about this is now seeing the slights and dealing with things with my children.
Right.
I'm now living for them and trying to help them get into a space where they can go out in the world and be the confident people they need to be, et cetera. And I'm trying to help them navigate things. And so, as far as me and my wife is concerned, we're good, but don't mess with our kids.
Buddy, I love it. Shawn, anything you want to add to that, my man?
First and foremost, I want to say, Brian, thanks for your perspective and your transparency and realization in terms of the difficulties and complexities that you've been dealing with. And I think your voice is a voice that's not heard a lot, but your perspective would be valued. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing that with us, because I appreciate that. That's really, really impactful. So don't think that that's going to be glazed over for anyone watching this. For me, I knew I was ready because my wife is my day one. She's my ride or die. I'm a kid from Brooklyn, New York, right? And we have to keep our head on a swivel, right? I grew up in a time where there was Bloods, Crips, gangs, Lion Kings. And I lived, my family was middle class. So we had what was considered a little bit of money, which we all know it was not real money, right? in the grand scheme of things. But, I had nice shoes. I had Jordans and things like that. So I was always confident in myself as a person. Like for me, I've always been a confident person. But the one thing that I held on my back was I always wanted to make my parents proud. I always wanted to make my community proud. I always wanted to make my people proud. I've always been that kind of person. And then you fall in love with your best friend, and your best friend's from a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
But they share the same values. And then when you fall in love with that person, what made me knew I was ready to go forward. And it doesn't matter what anybody cares. When she came to me and said, I need to know what we're doing here. Are we committed to this situation? Because if we committed to the situation, I'm going to let everybody know in my world that I'm doing this, and they're either here with me or they're not. Whoever's here with me or not. So the fact that she wrote a letter, showed it to me, said, I'm going to send this to my parents because I need to communicate this, because we are really serious about our relationship. We're going to take this next step forward. That right there is everything. That's when I knew it was me and her against the world, even to this day. And we go through phases and chapters of your life where you put on the armor or you grow the callus and it doesn't bother you, it doesn't matter. But then to Robert's point and Brian's point, when your kids come into this world, it's your heart outside of your body. And you know how to handle it and you know how to deal with it. But when the slights come their way, you go all berserk and it's like the wound is reopened. So now you know how to manage that. And I love my wife even more these days because now she is now seeing it from a different eye, from a different lens, sort of similar to Brian, right? Whereas now it's like, you know what? We may not have a Black affinity group in our school or whatever the case may be is, but I'm going to build one, right? Even though I'm not, because I know my kids need that support system.
Yeah.
And, it's these kind of things that it validates and reaffirms that that's the person that you rock with. That's the person that you ride with. That's the person that you married. And you knew from day one you made the right choice. It wasn't about the culture. It wasn't about the skin. It wasn't about the hair. It wasn't about any of the physical parts. It was all that feeling, that heart that you organically felt in the beginning.
Right.
And that's what makes it easy for probably Brian and Robert and myself and to move forward, no matter what the difficulties are.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. I'm going to jump in this real quick and tell a quick story because one of the things with me and my wife is white, and my wife is from a small town outside of Boston. She grew up like Brian, not a lot of diversity at all. And the things that we used to go through when we started dating, she never saw that before. She never experienced that. Matter of fact, when she was dating, her boyfriend prior to me was a white guy. They didn't go through the things that her and I went through when we go to restaurants or stuff to that nature, right? And then when we had kids, but it took her a while to see it because prior to our relationship, these things didn't affect her, all right? And sometimes I thought like, wow, she's with me and now she's got to deal with stuff that had she dated somebody else, she would have never dealt with, at least from a racial standpoint. Does that make sense, my brothers? Right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's why it's important that sometimes people, when you come from a certain background and then all of you may not see certain things, but then all of a sudden you get a mate that's from a totally different background and it exposes you to things that you've never experienced before. So those are the things that's very important to understand. But I want to go to your kids because, one of the things is like, Robert, your son was on the episode Too Black to Be White, Too White to Be Black, and he shared his experience. So I want to hear about some of the things that your kids go through. But first, the first question I want to ask you, before you had kids, did you and your wife sit down and talk about what was going to come by having kids?
Yes, this is Robert. So yes, we did, but I think to your point that until it became a reality, the conversation didn't land in the same way. Because it's very important to know that when we have children, people will consider the children Black in my situation. Various things may happen to them because of the color of their skin, but the real issue is it's an abstract thing until you actually see it, until it actually happens, until your child actually comes home and verbalizes things. So even hearing the earlier podcast episode and hearing from our son about things provokes a conversation because we're not always talking about it, but it's something that's there. And now our children are able to elaborate on situations that they encounter, and it makes it real.
Brian, what about you, buddy?
So prior to my daughter being born, we talked a lot about the fact that my wife's third language is English. So do we want my child to speak other languages? Absolutely. We talked about religion. We came from different religious backgrounds. We talked about, cultural differences and things, but we never talked about it from the point of ethnicity. But to Robert's point, it hits pretty hard when you're faced with it in reality years later. A perfect example is COVID. Being like we're again in a pretty homogenous community and being one of the very few Asian kids in the school during COVID, you can imagine some of the comments that were flying at my child, go back to China, a lot of that stuff. And you just things you would never conceive of that your kid would have to go through, and you don't even realize it until after it's happened, right? So how do you prepare your kid for something like that? So we deal with it as it comes, and we try to deal with it as best as we can. But a lot of times it's such a surprise to us that it happens, just because in our minds, like, our relationship has been well accepted since it's been for 15, 16 years. But our kid's just now developing her identity, developing her relationship. So she's experiencing a whole new set of challenges that we may never have faced during our relationship. So it's taking it as it comes.
What about you, Shawn? Thanks, Brian.
For me, I we had conversations culturally from a religious standpoint, but for us, we had a lot of similarities in terms of the way we wanted our kids to be raised. We knew we wanted them to celebrate both sides of their culture and their backgrounds. There wasn't a question about that. We knew they were going to, wear Indian garb and clothes, and then they were going to hear reggae and calypso from my culture and things of that nature. So we knew that we had a very aligned approach. What we did not, I think, anticipate was how early we would need to have been prepared for the dialogue of them being sort of put into a box earlier on and facing certain things that they may not be able to ingest and understand why people say certain things or why people want to touch their hair and that's why their hair is so curly or why my daughter wears braids, versus, it being out and them coming to us and asking us questions of, oh, I want my hair to be yellow and down like my friends, or, why do my friends ask me how brown my skin is and does it rub off? And when you get approached with those things in real life, in real time, and you're not able to react, it's a bit shocking, right? It catches you off guard. You have to deal with it, but to Robert's point, it's a theory in your head. You're just like, yeah, we're going to deal with it. We're going to approach it. There's tons of things to read and stuff like that, and we'll understand it very progressively. And then it hits you in the face like a Mike Tyson punch in the nose, and then you're just like, whoa, wait a second.
So back up for a second. You said so, and I want you all to speak to this because I one of the things that we dealt with our kids is that some people would make fun of them and call them different names because they were mixed, they were biracial. Mm. So when you said they're trying to put them in a box, like what do you mean specifically?
Meaning we've always taught our kids that there are two sides of them. They're half and half.
Right.
But when they go out into the world only sees them as one thing.
Right.
That part.
Right. And then, so how do you deal with that? So because when the kids go out, right, you only can protect them you only can do a little bit, right? Once they walk out in the world will then deal with them. All right. So how do you deal with that with your children? And I would like all you guys to jump in on this as well. And how does it make you feel?
I mean, you know me, Tony, I'm a strategy guy. I come up with a plan, right? So not only am I going to instill that in the home by repetitively making sure my kids know who they are, we celebrate, cultural days and holidays. We make sure they understand their heritage. We make sure they understand where they're from and music and food and traditions. But we also make sure we share that with the teachers at school. And we also make sure that we invite their friends to celebrations that are culturally relevant and teach them certain ways to let them know that this is part of their friends' culture. So now, maybe not the parents so much, but their friends will now know. Their friends will now understand why when my kid shows up with, Indian clothes, because he's celebrating Holi or a different festival or a different holiday that's part of his culture. So it's things like that we make sure we instill in them, but also we invite and pull people in, as well as the communities that they are in on a regular basis to make sure that everyone is aware. So I usually am tired of educating other people, but it's actually my job to make sure that my kids are in a safe environment and that I'm educating and letting people know about who they are as people.
Brian.
I think for my daughter, what we've done is just make sure that she gets exposure to not just her own heritage, but because she appreciates the fact that she has a mixed heritage, we've just tried to develop that appreciation for other children of other heritage. So there are not a lot of kids in our school district that are Filipino heritage, But there are kids that are Southeast Indian, or there are kids that are from the Caribbean, or there are kids from South America. So those are the kids that she's tended to gravitate towards and become friendly with, because we've taught her this just to appreciate, look, she's different. If people are going to view her as different, how do you think all these other children feel that may be exposed to the same things? So she's gravitated towards those social groups and those social structures. And we've looked for opportunities to get her more involved in things like that. Originally, we had her on a swim team where she was the only non-Hispanic kid, because we wanted to give her a different, set of exposure than if she had joined the team here, where it would have been all white kids.
Right.
So for us, it's just about expanding our horizons, make sure that she's very worldly and has just a greater appreciation for other people's cultures, and not worry so much whether or not other people have appreciation for hers.
Robert?
So one of the things that my children are blessed with is that we joke about it, but especially my wife's side of the family, we joke and say that we have like a United Nations kind of feel there, because we not only have the racial, diversity in the family, but we also have religious diversity. So we have Jewish in our family, so celebrate some Jewish holidays. There is a sexual orientation change in difference. So we celebrate everybody. So that's one thing. But one of the things for me, particularly as it relates to black and white, is I really work with my children on educating them about their history first, because those who don't learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. And then also want to instill a confidence in them that they can carry themselves in this world with their head held high,
Right.
that they have nothing to be ashamed about. They have nothing to answer to. They are their own people. And so that they have the tools in a toolkit to deal with a lot of situations. As a parent, my job is to kind of help them be ready to go out into the world when I'm no longer standing around them or near them.
Right.
And so I'm trying to work with them to get them to fill up that toolkit with all the tools they need to be able to handle a lot of different situations. So some of it is that street awareness, and you understand where you are and the context of your being in the relation to everybody else. Trying to get them to understand in their lives how to connect with people, because sometimes you can disarm people when you connect on a one-on-one basis with them. Like I said, trying to give them many different things in their toolkit to be able to go about dealing with the world, because I know at a certain point in their lives, they're going to be on their own, whether they're away at college or beyond, and they're going to have to deal with the world on its terms, but they have to be able to bring themselves to that point and thrive. And that's what I'm trying to get them to do.
What are some of the so when it comes to your family, it comes to your marriage, what are some of the things that you guys, you talked about your kids, and specifically you, and you all said it, people try to put them in a box. They only can be one part of their ethnicity versus their entire part. What's some of the outrageous things that you guys deal with when it comes to interracial marriage and family?
So for me, I say, especially this day and age, it's my daughter. And, I know hearing the other episode of the podcast, your daughters kind of deal with the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's the dealing with the hair, people wanting to touch the hair, wanting to do a lot of things, trying to get my daughter particularly, trying to work with her to deal with the world, because I am not a black woman. And I don't have that intersectionality where I can understand what the world is like for a black woman. And I'm very blessed and very thankful that my mom and my sister and others in my family step forward to help my daughter when those issues come up, where there are things that she needs to deal with outside of things that I can give her, and that she has resources there to be able to help her, because it is strange for somebody in my mind, because nobody ever does it to me. They just walk up and start touching my hair. If
Right.
somebody comes up and starts touching my hair or lack thereof, it's time to fight. What are we doing touching me like that?
Right.
But women are supposed to take that and it's supposed to be fine.
Right.
It's not.
Exactly. Anybody
For
else?
me,
Brian?
it's the
That's a
observations.
difficult question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Brian.
You said it's a difficult question. Go ahead, Brian.
I do think it's a difficult question, because it's hard for me to categorize things as outrageous after 16 years. But I think one of the things that has always shocked me a little bit is just the expectation that our relationship must be more challenging than anyone else's relationship. And I don't think it is.
Right.
We deal with the same things that any couple would deal with. We fight over the same stupid things that people fight over. We agree on, the same goofy things that people agree on. We deal with a lot of the similar things with children. And I just don't think that it's as extreme as a lot of people think. And I think just that expectation, like I know, my parents are very open. They were very accepting of my wife when we were dating. But I think they thought that there was going to be more tension in our relationship. And I think that a lot of my friends thought there would be more tension in the relationship because of the ethnic differences. And I just don't think it lives up to their expectations. It really hasn't been, that challenging for us one-to-one relating because of race. It really hasn't been.
Right, right. Shawn?
From a marriage standpoint, it's I want to say I don't know if it's died down or more just I'm now unaware of it or don't care anymore, and so I'm less sensitive to it or less cognizant of it. Where you would be stared at for long periods of time on a train ride from like the time you get on the train till you get off the train. Just don't know what it is, but it's just outrageous. Like you're going to stare at me for 20 minutes. That's very weird and awkward, right? So, those are some of the things that happened earlier on. But as we got older, I guess life changes. You put yourself in certain situations where you are more comfortable, I guess. So things like that don't happen as much. But from a kid's perspective, and dealing with a family perspective, just the things that kids are saying because they're curious sometimes and they're not being exposed to different people or different cultures. So they have these questions, which are obviously really innocent, but they come from a place of just lack of exposure. And I wouldn't say they're outrageous. They're just naive, but what I do sense is that my kids don't ask the same questions back. And that's the point that I'm still trying to figure out in real time,
Right.
to be honest with you.
Right. So I got to say,
Tony,
guys.
Tony, really
Go ahead.
quick, let me jump in on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
So one of the things is also a basis of comparison. Like what we go through in our lives with our marriages and with our children is kind of our normal. So the word outrageous is a little bit different because it's just normal for us.
Correct.
The issue is when you have a basis of comparison to somebody else's experience, and then you can see something different. So for instance, if I were to find out, for instance, that my wife and I are trying to buy a house in a certain neighborhood, and if I'm the person who is the lead on the conversation, I get, a mortgage rate at a certain level.
Exactly.
If she does it separately, or she takes pictures of me out of the house, then all of a sudden it's a totally different conversation. The value of the house is higher,
Exactly.
whatever. And those kind of things would be really outrageous. That hasn't happened to us in particular, but I'm saying if we had that basis of comparison, then we could realize how out of whack things may actually be for us, and we're just not aware.
Yeah. So, and that's where I was going to, because, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, when I say I'm talking about the stuff that's, yes, we deal with, but the other people don't. So I can give you a million examples, because I was just about to say maybe me and my family are the only ones, right? Because my daughters told my wife one time, every time Daddy goes to the store, they were like 4 and 5. He gets followed, okay? And I didn't even know. My daughters said this, all right, at 4 and 5. They always follow him in the store. Okay, so I can give you a million examples of stuff
definitely.
that we dealt with, right? That, yeah, we have calluses. My wife, when we were on vacation and girls were 1 and 2 or 2 and 3, and white women would come up to her and say, "Are they your kids? Are they yours?" And be very sarcastic and nasty. Okay, so I'm just telling you, maybe because and again, like I said, we build up callous. My wife had to build up calluses. My wife now sees things that she never saw before, especially since we had kids, okay, that people say, or they say slights, or they do microaggressions that she wouldn't even know what a microaggression was before until we had kids, right? So that's what I mean about outrageous, some of the things that people do or say that you wouldn't get in a typical, regular, equal racial relationship.
And so when I say like building a toolkit for the kids, because now that's, like I said, that's my life. They're my world, and trying to get them to be ready to deal with those microaggressions, get them to be able to deal with, not overt aggression and how that might happen, and from different people as well. So, I know we always, a lot of times when you talk about race, you start talking about dealing with police and other sources of authority, but how to deal with those situations, like how the idea is to come back home. and not to
Right.
say something or do something that is going to aggravate, so let's have some de-escalation strategies if you need to have those kind of things. I want my children to understand the world a little bit differently. I tell my son all the time, for instance, and he mentioned this on the podcast, that I told him that when he is with a group of a racially diverse group of people, and something goes down and it goes a little south, to remove himself from the situation, because when the police come, they come to him first.
Right.
As a 6-foot biracial, 16-year-old, he is going to be the one they ask first, or attack or grab or do whatever first. So I'm trying to tell him to be smart, to be aware of what's happening, and if things are going the wrong way, to remove yourself from those situations so that you are not caught up in somebody else's mess.
Right.
So there are a lot of things that are happening, but as I said, it is basically now I'm moving on to making sure that my kids have the tools to deal with those microaggressions or overt aggressions or whatever, because I want them to be able to thrive in this world.
Got it. Got it. So, guys, final thoughts. I want to get from you, what's your final thoughts? What do you want the audience to know about interracial marriage? 57 years after Loving versus Virginia, Supreme Court makes interracial marriage legal. Brian, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the first thing is to realize that 57 years is just not a long time. It really isn't. And yes, we've come a long way. And I worry, just based on what we're seeing today politically and otherwise, that, 57 years is going to feel a lot closer than it even is. So I'm very worried about that. And I think, people need to talk about it. People need to bring it up, bring it to the forefront. Don't be afraid to have conversations about it. The other thing, my parting thought is, my goodness, I have learned so much from Robert and Shawn today. I'm so thankful that I got to be a part of this. Just hearing your perspectives, I'm coming away so much wiser. So I'm just so thankful I was part of this.
It's awesome, buddy. And let's be fair though too. You brought a lot of wisdom as well. Okay, you definitely threw some nuggets out there that we all can learn from. So I really appreciate that, Shawn.
Yeah, appreciate that, Brian. Like I said, I appreciate your viewpoint. It's a viewpoint we don't hear too often. Would love to hear more of that. But for me, what do I want people to know? The funny thing is, relationships, family, kids, wives, like it's all hard. Like life is generally not the easiest thing ever. But it's not about being black, white, Asian, Latinx, whatever it is. It's about being a person first. And I think for me, with all the things that are happening in the past few years politically and, what's been happening to divide in the country, what we don't see statistically or what people keep forgetting is that the integration of cultures and races are exponentially happening as well. So there's going to be, the majority is going to be the minority soon. And I want to say that I have a tremendous amount of faith in the children today. Robert's children and Brian's children and Tony's children, because your children are older than mine. I have a tremendous amount of faith in how they're moving and maneuvering in the world. I'm so hopeful, right? And I believe that they're going to do the right things and make the right choices. I just don't want them to be impacted by the things that we do today. So what I want to leave here in this conversation is that there is a lot of hope later, right? Let's just not mess it up for them to not have a runway to take off. And we have to understand that we are people first. We have to love one another, no matter what ilk or creed you're from, and always start there.
Love it. I love it, my brother. Thank you. Robert, close us out, buddy.
All right. So, Tony, first of all, thank you for the platform. Shawn and Brian, thank you for sharing. I really, really do appreciate the conversation. So for me, my parting shot is really around not taking for granted the progress that was made. I know that especially in this political and judicial climate, things are in some cases rolling backwards, and we can't allow that to happen, because our children and our children's children and everybody else moving forward will be impacted if we allow progress to roll backwards, and we don't want that. As far as our families are concerned, our families are loving units, and as Shawn is saying, we are certainly a melting pot in this country, and there's a lot of diversity, and that's a strength. And we have to make sure that we uphold that strength for everybody, and make sure that everybody, our children in particular, have the toolkits and tools ready so that they can go out and deal with the world and really make sure that they have a choice and a voice in how we do things as we move forward. That they need their platforms to be able to speak on these things, to talk to each other, to recognize our differences, celebrate them, and to also not allow them to be caught up in this political whirlwind that's happening right now where things are looking backwards. We need them to continue to move forward.
Well, thank you, buddy. And I really feel by you guys coming on and chatting about this that it's going to help people move forward. Here's the kicker. And you all kind of said it too, that yes, it's only been 57 years, and Brian, you're 100% right, which is not a long time. However, in 1967, only 3% of the country agreed with interracial marriage. In 2024, 96% agree with interracial marriage. So just to be fair, going back to what you guys, we have made from a mindset standpoint in terms of people approving interracial, I believe, and Noel can look this up, but I think, if I remember correctly, 20% of all new marriages are interracial now. Okay. So and back to your point, Shawn, I think you said it, or maybe Robert said it, that, the country is becoming way more diverse. It's going to be the minority, will be the majority, if you believe whatever, in 30 years, whatever the case may be. So, and back to what everyone said, I do agree. I think the kids, we're hopeful. We have a bright future with our kids because they're growing up in a more diverse world. They're more accepting. But I think the other thing, though, too, they're more empathetic of what other kids go through, and they can see individuals versus groups, okay, which I think is a great way where we're heading. So, number one, Brian Stern, Shawn Norville, Robert Towns, thank you for coming on the Black Executive Perspective podcast and providing your perspective on this difficult topic. So now I think it's time for
Tony's Tidbit.
So today's tidbit is by Maya Angelou, and it states, "Love recognizes no barriers. It jumps hurdles, leaps fences, penetrate walls to arrive at its destination full of hope." And you heard that today from Brian, Shawn, and Robert about their relationships and how solid they are and how they're building their family, not just for today, but for the future. So, more importantly, I want to thank you for joining another episode of a Black Executive Perspective podcast. And I want everyone now to listen and incorporate BEP call to action, which is called LESS, LESS. Our goal is to decrease racism and all the isms. So we want everyone to incorporate LESS. L stands for learn. We want you to learn about other different cultures, other different individuals, history, because by learning, you're going to enlighten yourself and be more open to other individuals. E stands for empathy. Once you've learned, now you should be more empathetic to your fellow human being and what they deal with. S stands for share. You should share what you learn to your friends and family so they can become enlightened as well. And the other S stands for stop. Everybody's role is to stop discrimination wherever it walks in your path. So if you're at the Thanksgiving table and Grandpa says something inappropriate, you say, "Grandpa, we don't say that." Okay? So if everybody incorporates LESS, LESS, we'll build a fairer, a more understanding world, and everyone will be able to see the change that you want to see. Follow a Black Executive Perspective podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and you can follow us on our socials of LinkedIn, X, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook at a Black Exec. For our fabulous guests, Shawn Norville, Brian Stern, Robert Towns, and our fantastic producer who made all this happen, Noel Miller, I'm Tony Tidbit. We talked about it. We love you, and guess what? We're out.
A Black Executive Perspective.